we made it. We've made it through the summer. Well, most of us have made it through the summer. Some of us are still just wondering just a little bit if we've actually made it all the way through the summer. But at the church, we've made it. We've been studying giants of the faith. And we've been hearing about Noah and Esther and Joseph and Rebekah. We've heard about Moses and Abraham and Nehemiah. We've heard about an unlikely giant who was really just a servant girl. Last week we heard about King David, who we've talked about as perhaps being the biggest giant of all the New Testament or Old Testament. And some have even mentioned there's one more, because we kind of built up to David. But there's today's giant. Today's giant is the last one for the summer session. I have to tell you, I've been really proud of this congregation. I've been proud of this congregation because they have been willing and even anxious to see the series on giants through. Because we have been inspired by these characters. We've learned from them. And some of the things that we've learned is that Noah taught us one person can make a difference. Turn to a neighbor and tell them that. One person can make a difference. You know, we learned from Esther that God has a place and a plan. Turn to somebody else and say, God has a place and a plan for you. We learned about Joseph not to ever give up the dream. Repeat after me. I'm not giving up. I'm not giving up. Well, you like that one better. You like yelling at the pastor, don't you? Works pretty well. We learned about Rebekah and living by giving, and we've learned from Abraham that God always does the right thing. Always. We've learned about Nehemiah, who taught us, and I think this is really important, that no problem is too big for God. Repeat that with me. No problem is too big for God. And then we met the unlikely giant, and Sherry came portraying this servant girl who taught us that no matter who we are, no matter how high or how low we think we are, no matter how young or old, rich or poor, God can use us. So turn to a neighbor and tell them, God can use even me. God can use even me. Because I know that there are people in this room that don't believe that. You realize that, don't you? You know that there are people who say, God can't use me. God won't use me. Whoops. And He'll never use me to be a drunk pastor. And then David. David taught us to live up to our potential, not down to the limitations of the people around us. Oh, how important it is to know that and to remember that and to hold on to the fact that God says you have potential. There is potential in your bones for God's work. I'm so proud of you as a congregation because I have to tell you, I've had people actually calling or stopping me, asking me, what should I read to get ready for next week's giant? Who is next week's giant? They don't even wait for the newsletter to come out, and because Robin and I will put the next giant in the newsletter. Sunday afternoons, Monday mornings, I'm getting questions. Who's coming up? How do I prepare? I have to tell you, if you You want to make a pastor feel good, and it's never really a bad thing to make your pastor feel good. Just so you know. Ask them what they're preaching on next week. Be interested in where we're going as a church. See where we're being led. Today's giant is Jonathan. We don't know very much about Jonathan as a whole. We don't know too much about him, but at least better than Rebecca, we've heard of him. He comes from the same era as David. In fact, he is, in the language of the day, he is David's BFF. Best friend forever. For those of you who aren't quite up to date on today's initials. Who is he? Well, Jonathan is King Saul's oldest son. He is in line to be the next king of Israel. He is educated beyond belief. He has the best clothes. He has the best house. He has the best of everything that Israel had to offer. He was, according to society, the man with all the right stuff. And he was a great guy. He wasn't just a nice guy. He was a great guy. He had loyalty and courage and strength. He was the guy that most of the people of Israel were sure was going to be the next king. And they were getting in line to follow him wherever he was going to lead. Only one problem. Only one problem. God hadn't chosen him to be the next king. He'd chosen David. We learned that last week. King Saul had goofed up the kingdom so bad that God had to start all over. And so he went and he found the lowest nobody of nobodies to make them the king. Jonathan and David were so different. Jonathan had it all. David had nothing. Jonathan was educated. David learned everything he learned watching sheep. Jonathan had the best tickets to the good concerts. David had to make his own music. Jonathan probably looked good, smelled good, and felt good. I guarantee you, David probably did not look good, feel good, and I know that he did not smell good. If you need to understand that, go lay with sheep for a week, and then stand next to your best friend and see how far away they want to be. Only one problem: God didn't want him to be the next king. He had it all. He could have forced the issue. Saul certainly wanted him to be the next king. After all, that's what you raise your sons for when you're the king. Here's the good news. The good news is that Jonathan didn't want the job. Oh, I think he probably at first wanted the job. After all, who wouldn't want to be king? How many of you in this room would really like to be king sometime? Well, Betty, I know you well enough. You're right. You don't want to be king. You want to be the queen. Just so you know, I know what all you women are thinking. But in David's day, being king was king. And Jonathan wanted to be king. But Jonathan knew that the kingdom was no longer his. Jonathan knew that God had given up on his father. He knew that David had been chosen. And the good news is Jonathan was all right with that. In fact, better than all right, Jonathan, unlike his father, unlike David's brothers, and even David's father, could see the potential for greatness in David. He could see and grasp the magnitude of God's great big picture of what could be. And seeing the big picture, the vision, makes all the difference in the world. I want you to turn to a neighbor and tell them, I want to see the big picture.
I want to see the big picture.
Really? Do you really want to see the big picture? Do you want to see the big picture? Or do you want to just stay focused on that one little dot on the page? The whole thing. You know, one of the things the computer world has done is it's made printing easier. I don't know if you know that, but when printers first came out, they used to print by making little tiny dots on the page. And the closer the dots were, the more solid the picture was. And then they figured out that they could use colored ink to make dots on the page, and so you could have color pictures. I had a friend once send me a picture. The only problem was when I opened it up on the computer, it was really just, well, it looked to me like one dot about the tip of my pinky. It's like he dipped his finger in some ink and went boop. And then he saved it on his computer, and then he sent it to me. He says, "Isn't this cool?" Being the brilliant conversationalist I was, I looked at the picture. Cool. You know, my eyes weren't as bad then as they are now. I didn't have to put on glasses to see a dot on the page. Today, I'd have to put my glasses on so I could see the dot. I wrote back to him, I said, "Cool, it's a dot on the page." He said, "Blow it up, make it bigger." He'd taken an American flag and condensed it, and condensed it, and condensed it, and condensed it, until it looked like a dot. But when I went into my computer and magnified it, magnified it, magnified it, all of a sudden I saw the flag. And it was waving. It was really cool. You had to see the big picture to appreciate it. Most of us, I think, focus on the little dots. I'll be honest. Most of us are a little bit afraid of the big picture because, you see, the big picture might mean that 6-letter word. That's not counting. It might mean that most awful word, right?
Probably starts with a C and ends with a
Change. Thank you. None of us really want to change except if it's going to make us better. But most of us think we're as good as we're already going to be. I want you to know that seeing the big picture can change our lives. Seeing the big picture can change our direction. Seeing the big picture can mean a whole different world for each and every one of us. And I think most of us deep down would like a different world. Would like a bigger world. Would like a more powerful world. And you see, you'll never get it. You'll never, ever, ever get it until we see the big picture. That's what Jonathan understood, and that's what we're going to talk just a little bit about, because seeing the big picture allows some great things to happen. The first thing that seeing the big picture allows us to see ourselves in the right perspective. It means that we'd be able to take a mirror out. This isn't a mirror, but it's kind of shiny. Oh, that's terrible. Well, that's pretty scary. It's not quite a good mirror that you all have seen in the mirror. And I'll bet you all got up this morning and you looked in the mirror to do your hair. My wife was probably saying, "Did you brush your hair today?" I did, but it was a long time ago. We looked in the mirror, and I know what some of you said. Some of you looked in the mirror and went, "Oh, my God, what happened last night?" Some of you looked in the mirror and said, "All right." But the spouse said, "No." How you see yourself in the mirror is really important when you're looking at the big picture. You see, the big picture helps put everything in perspective, including who we are. And it helps us to know and understand that we need to see ourselves as God sees us. You see, when we see ourselves in the light of the big picture, it helps us to judge ourselves realistically and to understand our own value. That's right. Everybody in the room has value. Most of us tend to either underestimate our value or overestimate our value. Some of us underestimate our value, which means that we downgrade what God has said about us. For you were created in the image of God, and you are one of those creations that God has said is very good. But we, in our mock humility, say, "Oh no, not me. I'm not that. I'm only human." Some of us overestimate our value to God as well, and that just simply blows up our ego and makes people go, "Oh, if they only knew who they were." You see, seeing the big picture does allow us to see ourselves in the right perspective, in the right arrangement and right relationship with God. Most of us in this room know and understand that we're either in a right relationship with God or not. By the way, those are the two choices. There is no middle fence here. There is no tightrope to walk between being right with God and not right with God. One of the things that really stands out here as we think about the big picture of life is deciding what side of the fence we want to really be. Now, the second thing seeing the big picture does is it allows us to see others in the right perspective too. How many of you at one time or another have looked at somebody and said, forget them? Come on, any of you ever do that? You ever look at your neighbor's yard and go, "I can't wait till they move"? Oh, some of you have those neighbors. I won't make you raise your hands on that because you might be living next to the person sitting next to you. You see, when you see yourself in the right perspective, you're free to treat others with respect and honor as well. In other words, you're allowed to see and treat them with the right perspective too. You know, Jonathan, he had it all. He had it all. It was within his grasp. He could see his father's kingdom coming to an end, and by training and education, he had learned that he was next. That song, Anticipation, was probably on his lips a lot. Until he met David. Until David showed up one day and slayed, killed Goliath. And when he saw David and met David and got to know David, he knew that helping David made the kingdom better than if he alone were king. He understood that in the big picture, David was God's choice to rule the kingdom. And if David ruled the kingdom, God's kingdom would be greater than if he ruled the kingdom. And so he began to serve David faithfully. He invested his time in what was the most valuable of ways. He saw the big picture. He also learned, thirdly, that seeing the big picture allowed him, and it will allow us, to do that which is right from God's perspective. Jonathan gave up his rights in order to save and serve his country, and the result was the kingdom of David, the greatest kingdom in Israel's history, the kingdom from which God brought forth the Messiah. Jonathan's service to David has changed every believer's life. Yours, mine, the members of the church down the street. Every believer was changed because Jonathan could see the big picture. And he served in such a way that it affects us today. Jonathan brings some great words of encouragement and of hope because he saw the big picture. He would tell us that only when we see the important, when we see the big picture, only when you can see those things, will you be able to do the seemingly unimportant. He teaches us that, quite frankly, it takes a lot of kingmakers to make a king. Serve up to the vision, he says. See the big picture. Serve the big picture. At First Christian Church, we have a big picture. It's called becoming a place of intentional grace. It's really about becoming, and thank you, Sheila, for this image, for becoming a sanctuary. A place of love and acceptance and forgiveness. A place of safety and hope. A place of energy and rest. A place of challenge and completeness. That's why we need greeters and teachers, elders and deacons, team members and leaders. Because to become a sanctuary, to become a place of grace, a place of intentional grace, you have to do it intentionally. The second thing Jonathan might tell us is that every time you encounter people with potential, you have to make a choice. And there are only two. There are only two choices. You can help them, or you can hurt them. Help them, or hurt them. If Saul had seen David's potential and helped him, the nation of Israel would have grown faster, become more united, and blessed more people than ever. But instead, Saul fought David every step of the way. And the kingdom was divided for year after year after year after year. Productive things would have happened instead of destructive things. The thought here is that when we don't serve the bigger picture, the one we hurt the most may be ourselves. Because Saul went down in history as the king who God left. The third thing Jonathan teaches us is that as a supporter, you share the success. As an obstacle, you keep people away from the grace of God. The vision from God is great. It's important. And I'm going to tell you that we can no longer hide from it. We can no longer run from it. We can either work together for it and become giants in the faith, or we can be divided and simply fall away like the giant Goliath. You know that's what happened when David killed the giant Goliath. He never heard about it again, except in the stories of Sunday school, talking about the greatness of God. We can choose, like Jonathan, to support the mission, or we can be the King Sauls and work to destroy it. It sounds harsh, I know, but the truth is that when we work together as the church, the vision is shared and people's lives are changed. When we see the church as our own instead of God's, no one's lives are changed and the vision falters. The lessons from this entire session and series on giants have been simple and few. They have repeated themselves over and over again, and there are three. God uses the people who are willing to go. Social stature makes no difference, and seeing and serving the big picture makes you a giant. How many in this room want to be a giant in the faith? You can't. It's simple. When God says go, you go. Don't blame your social stature for not doing what God calls you to do. And see and serve the big picture. And that makes you a giant. And all of God's people said,